How do you all handle situations like when a flood comes in our area and stuff like that, and fish is like laying in fields and things like that?
Well, that can be an issue. And another problem is, especially people that have ponds along the major river, like the Cumberland River. If it floods, then the fish from the ponds can get in the river too. So it kind of works works both ways. In fact, we've recently seen some. They're called grass carp. And they're triploid, which means actually a grass carp is a fish that we can stock in ponds to control vegetation. They eat vegetation, and so a lot of pond owners have those in their ponds, and we've seen those in the Cumberland River, which is, I'm sure, has come from flooded ponds.
So you're out and about doing all this great work, and it keeps you busy being a biologist here. And you've got to do a lot of science, a lot of studies, and do you ever have to like take some fish from this area and transform them back over in this area?
Well, not really that so much, but we do have 2 hatcheries in the state that raise all of the fish we stock throughout the state. We have a Minor Clark Fish Hatchery in Moorhead that raise muskie and walleye, smallmouth bass, and some specialty species every once in a while. We also have Frankfort Fish Hatchery, or Pfeiffer Fish Hatchery in Frankfort, Kentucky, that raise largemouth bass, sunfish, crappie, and those are stocked throughout the state in selected water bodies. And then finally, we actually have a federal hatchery, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, at Wolf Creek Dam below Lake Cumberland. There's a federal hatchery, and they raise all the trout that we stock in the state.
Give us a basics of like a stocking. Like if you're going to go out to Laurel Lake, for an example, how much is supposed to be a stock in there?
Well, we generally the idea behind stocking is supplying a fish that either doesn't reproduce on its own and therefore wouldn't be there if we didn't stock it, or a fish that doesn't reproduce enough to maintain a fishable population. So, for instance, trout that we stock in Laurel Lake, they don't spawn in the lake, so essentially we can control their numbers by the number that we stock. And we also stock walleye in that lake. Walleye do reproduce in Laurel Lake, but not at a very large percentage of the fish are reproduced fish, so we have to maintain that population through stocking. Also, in the last decade or so, we've been monitoring the bass spawn, and if the bass have a poor year class, the largemouth bass, then we've been stocking in the fall to kind of boost that population, that year class, so that fishing's good years down the road.
And you got so many different types of fish. You got the big carps, you got the trout and all this, and this all has to be maintained.
Right. We primarily focus on the major sport fish, the ones that have size limits and creel limits. So like, for instance, in Laurel Lake, we have largemouth bass, spotted bass, smallmouth bass. We have walleye. We have rainbow trout. And then we have a variety of sunfishes. We have crappie. We have, bluegill, long-ear sunfish, just a big variety. So, and we do monitor those other fish, but especially focus on the game fish.
What's some of the biggest fish that you've seen or had to deal with? What's some records?
That's a good question. Actually, the largest bass that the largest largemouth bass we've ever seen came out of Laurel Lake. It's been a number of years ago, but it was right at 11 pounds.
Oh.
And of course, I didn't see this fish, but the state record largemouth came out of Wood Creek Lake, and it was, I think, 13 something. So anytime you see a bass, 7, 8, 9 pounds, that's a pretty good bass. I've seen Laurel's also known for smallmouth population. There's some really large smallmouth in that lake, and I've seen smallmouth. The biggest one I saw was one that was caught by Cooley Williams, which was no relation, but it was 8.5 pounds, and that's the largest smallmouth I've ever seen.
I tell you, these fish can get enormous.
We've seen walleye over 14 pounds out of Laurel Lake. So, you get to see some pretty nice fish. And actually, we've seen a striper. Probably the largest fish we ever saw was a striped bass out of Lake Cumberland. It was around 50 pounds. So,
oh, my goodness.
Yeah, so that's a good thing about this job. You get to see a variety of fish, and occasionally you get to see some really large fish. And I usually try to take my fishing pole along in case we shock something up there. I'll act like I caught it. So.
Well, it's wonderful getting back to nature and wildlife, and a lot of people really enjoy it. That's why we want to stress again. We need to protect our lakes and streams because a lot of chemicals might be poured in there, gasoline, oils, or stuff like that, sewage. We just need to keep a watch and protect us.
Right, and the public needs to be aware of those type things. And if you see someone doing something that's harming our streams, you need to report that to authorities so that can be stopped. I know in the past, especially in the eastern part of the state, failing septic systems have been a problem, where you have raw sewage going into streams. We've talked about just the trash and pollution going into our waterways. So I think if the public's in tune with that, and when they see something going on, to let the authorities know, and so we can help clean up our waterways.